Nader, I'm very, very moved. I'm going to send this to my mother. My mother loves Nader very much. I'm almost jealous. And so maybe when she reads this coming from Nader, she'll take me more seriously. Nader, thank you very much. I'm very moved. And I'm also very honored to speak from this podium, from Cooper. It's Cooper that has been speaking to us about architecture for very long, reminding us of its importance through tenacity, through looking closely and carefully at its poetics, at its role in society. So it's very humbling for me to speak to Cooper. I will do my best. As Nader mentioned, the title of the talk is Cyanometrics. I was also told to dim the lights so that they say lecture. There we go. Are you hearing me well, by the way? Yes. Thanks. During his travels in Latin America, Alexander von Humboldt would carry with him this device called a cyanometer. It's made out of 53 swaths of blue, and every time he would arrive to a location, he was fascinated with mountains and their sections in particular, he would pull this out and measure the exact swath of blue of the sky at that point. These documents ultimately came together in the canonical book, Cosmos, which was, in a way, the establishment of geography as a field, but also a document that attested to the ability of every location to be measured in relationship to universal principles, a cosmopolitanism of sorts that geography as a field has forgotten. But the idea that when you go to a place, you measure its flora and fauna and you document them. You draw carefully every single feature. And usually he would put architecture in those pieces that are grounded. And then to attest to the specificity of the place, he would turn to the sky and would register what the color blue was. Eventually, he and fellow geographers would completely abandon this tool because they would discover that the blueness was not so much affected by the density of the air or the specific humidity of the place, but by other impurities in the air, which in a way falsified the documentation. But there is something very beautiful about the idea that the sky, as universal and sheltering as it is of the whole world, has a certain specificity connected to place. And the idea that we would turn to the sky to measure specificity of the ground is something that has always appealed to me as a role that architecture could play, as a way of bringing architecture out of its mission to be grounded or out of its placement by other fields as the measure of locality, to also be reaching out to universality in some way. And the idea that it would be a shade of blue, at once detached from the sky, at once within it. Sometimes when the sun would set, the blue will stand out, but when it doesn't, the blue will disappear in the sky. That quality, that duality that architecture could play still preoccupies me. As Nader says, it verges sometimes on obsession. I would like to lay out the terms of this cyanometrics, of how we can measure architecture in relation to the sky, or how can we situate architecture within a larger global setting in which it is present, at once connected to the locality but also detached from it, making those bridges between a place and the rest of the world. The main protagonist of today's story is the city of Byblos, located north of Beirut, a population of about 40,000, 100,000 with its suburbs. Not a very big city, but a city that has grown very chaotically since the war. And yet, because of its World Heritage status, its downtown and the historic site have been preserved. And as a result of that, has managed to maintain both economically and in some respect, it's in urbanistically higher quality than other cities in the region, becoming more a kind of model for other cities to follow. In the foreground here, you see the archaeological sites that have been excavated since the 1920s and remains of the Ottoman axis in the city. I don't know if I have a pointer. No pointer? I won't need a pointer. I'll use my finger. And this is the archaeological site with a very iconic old house that is used as storage for the archaeological finds. And this is the view of the city from its suburbs. Kind of sporadic construction, rather chaotic, interspersed with agricultural fields here and there. The city thrives a lot on tourism, both historic tourism and religious tourism. And in this view, you see the old harbor with restaurants around, and an attempt, a kind of shy attempt at attracting international tourists. I love the name of this place, which combines different languages from French, English, and Spanish to describe a location. And then the religious tourism that has been on the map recently, especially in the region. This is a Crusader church that has been transformed at some point to a mosque and then back to a church, with the iconic veiled woman visiting, so showing the kind of plurality of the culture, and here Roman columns with an Umayyad mosque in the foreground. Byblos has tried to build on this historic tourism and religious tourism to attract youth and other tourists, and there's a very famous festival in the city every summer which has been attracting international figures. I don't know my gorillas very well, but for those of you who know the gorillas, it was at the Byblos concert that the gorillas took off their masks for the first time. So Byblos made history yet again at that concert. And the city has been, mayor after mayor, accumulating international funding and support. And actually, thanks to the fact that these mayors do not oppose each other's agendas, but build from them, it has managed to create a certain thickness in its urbanism and value that people notice when they visit. But people are not visiting, and they are waiting still for the tourists to come, given the situation in the region. And there's a sense of wait and see, a kind of heaviness in the air that gets lightened up by the occasional summer activity that happens along the coast. The other protagonists are the city municipal board. And here, a picture taken in 2012 of the mayor with his team, who have been my clients since 2011. A very dynamic group. Again, a group that provides continuity more than disruption from one election to the other. And here, standing in front of the World Christmas tree, they over-decorate every Christmas. I'll come back to that, and try to win awards in terms of the best Christmas tree decoration ever. This year, they just put up their Christmas tree. It's as horrible as the other ones. In 2011, we won a competition for the Byblos Town Hall. The competition was anonymous. It was also open. Anybody could present. And peculiarly, it was in black and white. Our competition entry was, the site was on the highway, and we thought that was ridiculous, but we went in ahead and presented 3 volumes, 3 abstract boxes that looked like they could be from the castle on the sea or modern office buildings, with gaps between them, spanning over a park that would continue underneath the building, an existing park that we managed to carry through underneath the building. The reason the competition was in black and white, we were told, was because some of the members of the jury were professors in the public universities, and in the public universities there's still a sense that printing in color is more expensive than black and white. So if you make the presentations in color, that means you're excluding a group. It's kind of equity logic in black and white. But what I will present tonight will be how we went from the kind of black and white presentation to a colored material presentation and how we actually built it, but how we actually over the years working with the city went from building the town hall to helping them in defining the waterfront of the city and also the master plan for the whole region, which are currently in the works. In doing that, I will try to elaborate more on the project of Cyanometrics and elaborate on it from different measurements, different scales, different attributes. From the idea of the relationship between architecture and geography, how grounded is it and how detached, how much part of the writing of the surface of the earth versus part of its description, and how do we calibrate that relationship through architecture, how architecture itself becomes the cyanometer by which we measure geography. I'll also talk about how architecture, in its commitment to being an object, can still maintain that distanciation, this displacement from the place it's in order to at once keep you there and take you somewhere else. And again, how do we calibrate that? How architecture, in its containment of the activities in it, provides a certain intensity of enclosure, but an openness for life to happen within, as if it is providing another sheltering sky at the smaller scale. How much does it relate to life, and how much does it leave life alone in order that life can be free? And how much do those surfaces of architecture, the surfaces which enclose but also which communicate, both in their materiality and in their symbolism, are able to maintain that communication level both at the local and at the universal scale? So let me start with the geographic aspect. And I keep the hyphen there because etymologically, geography is about the writing of the surface of the earth. And that could be a passive form, a description, or an active form, a fiction, an active creation of that surface. The site, as I mentioned earlier, is on the highway, actually in the interchange of the highway. And the idea was that the city wanted to move from being, can you see the cursor? Then I have an arrow. Okay. The site for the municipality used to be here, then moved temporarily to a site here, and now it's on the interchange. And the idea in this move was because many of the citizens of the city that had been displaced by the archaeology, but also by the tourism that happened here and living elsewhere, could find in this spot a kind of central spot. It was an act, a symbolic act of recentering, even though practically it wasn't really a good recentering because you were in the middle of the highway, which, as you know, becomes it's almost no man's land rather than everybody's land. The idea that a building could actually play a role in resetting or restructuring a relationship of larger territories has been a project in our office for a few years. Actually, our first project, 1998, the Housing for the Fishermen of Tyre, was exactly about that. A historic city, World Heritage Site, where the fishermen were living in a non-edificandi area, and with the passage of years, they could not live there anymore, so they had to move out, build in an agricultural terrain on their own, one which would be broken down by new laws into smaller parcellations, and their site was the last remaining bastion of the agricultural scale. And so our idea for that site was that we would preserve the scale of the agriculture and turn it into the communal scale for the fishermen displaced from the sea, and try to recover in the scale of that a sense of community. So you can see the difference in grain between the building of the housing and the neighboring buildings around, which are now either tobacco fields or banana fields, but now they're slowly eroding and being replaced by buildings like this one. In that sense, we tried to give a very urban exterior, but a kind of safe haven on the inside with remnants of the scale and character of the agricultural terrain before. A register. That same idea of architecture as a register we applied to the project of the balloon in downtown Beirut, where after the erasure of the ruins, in order to create larger parcels for tall buildings, there was a period of temporary uses of those parcels, and we tried to maintain that emptiness by clearing the surface for that helium balloon operation, but also using it as a terrain for public activity. And in doing that, we also showed through the adjustment of the terrain to accommodate for the balloon how that ground is made out of many layers by peeling off the ground and tucking underneath it the activities and the entrance to the balloon. But in doing that also, we proposed that the ground could be no matter how shortly, be given back to the city as a public domain. And for a very brief period, it succeeded at that. This idea of righting the surface emerges also in this project never built for a house by the coast in the Aegean, where in order to preserve the trees, we wove a passage between them, and that passage became the house. And in doing that, it inscribed a particular way of living, but also a particular passage between the trees to protect them, and that became the architecture. What it means when you look at it from the sky, I have no idea, but it does read as writing. And then these projects currently under construction, a series of apartment buildings that have been carved into the hillside, which is very difficult to do because usually you either carve the whole hill or you terrace it. And we managed to carve them in and reconstitute the hillside as a way that the buildings become themselves a register through the series of punctures around them of how they calibrate the slope and how they measure it at the same time. Another form of writing came in this installation in Amman. Another obsession of mine is watermelons, and in this case, we designed a landscape out of watermelons, working with the local watermelon suppliers who stack up their watermelons as pyramids. But here we made it a landscape of 7 hills, like Amman built on 7 hills, miniaturized in an oval space in order for it to be both a leisure space, demonstration of how everyday goods like watermelons become art, but also a miniaturization of geography through that scale. But perhaps the place where that connection to geography becomes strongest is in the series of houses which were built on the coastline north of Byblos for a family of siblings that lived there all together over the summer. And using the houses as a way both to recover the landscape and reconnect it, connecting these two very different terrains and very different topographies that have changed over the years, and using the way we manipulated the land parametrically in order to work on specific variables, visibility, so that no house can be seen from the sea level, but also that they would be blocking the views from the side, and recovering continuity of the landscape so that the houses can be very hardly visible from the street level, except for the little turrets, and much more open from the sea level. And there, the architecture holds on to its geometry, its specificity, its typological, I would say archetypal rigor in the sense of walls, retaining walls, and turrets and courtyards. But at the same time, in order for these houses to exist, the geography is reconstituted continuously as if it has always been there. And these are the houses encrusted in the land. One other aspect of this project that we tried to do is, in reading Brodel about the Mediterranean, he describes it beautifully as being the meeting place between the olive tree and the palm tree. And so we treated this site as exactly that, bringing the olives from across the street and the palms from the sea, and covering the ground with a kind of indigenous shrubbery that blossoms late in the summer, but using those paths also, the historic paths that existed on the site, to stitch between the two. And here you see the kind of way the landscape was formed, almost as sheep grazing between the trees, some of the historic eucalyptus trees, then the olive trees, and here the olives meeting the palms. Brodel would have been happy. But back to Byblos, we were faced with a site that I would say had no geography, had no site in it. An island in the middle of nowhere, pathetically the depository of gift after gift of sculptures and God-forsaken objects to the city, because they would seemingly be hosted there in a park, but nobody would ever visit them. And here the danger was that the municipality would end up being yet another one of those hideous sculptures. And you can see the access to the site was so difficult, and yet its visibility very strong. You would never know how to get there, even though you see it from everywhere. And so we started working with the city and realized that that chaos is actually spread all over the city. The city has grown immensely and actually never had a master plan done or executed since 1958, when Michel Ecochard proposed the actual highway, but based on land uses that were strictly archaeology, hardly tourism then, and agriculture. This was Byblos in 1958, compared to the images I showed you now. And this was the waterfront, which is almost archaeological, not touristic. And so we resorted to the idea, in this case, of operating not by trying to provide clarity at every level, but trying to identify within this chaos a series of figures in a kind of overdetermined field. And using the key requests of the city for clarity of entrance and transportation, the waterfront boardwalk, key public spaces, and entrances to the city, and the town hall itself, to inscribe in a kind of chaotic landscape a series of identifiable figures that you will be able to pull out of the larger chaotic terrain. In order to relieve the pressure on the interchange, we created two entrances that exist, but highlighted them further. We also created a loop under the highway that would connect the old and the new cities with a series of sites that would become public parking and significant public buildings on top of them, or commercial sites along, so that that site would also be used for public transport. A free shuttle bus was tried, and I think it's going to be quite successful. These are shuttle buses donated by some sister city in Europe, which are only used in the summer and parked under the tunnel over there. So we're trying to revive them to become a shuttle system that averts traffic. The figure of the highway itself as a divider has been very prevalent in the city. And here we're working with them to turn it into an actual gestalt, a figure that you see from the highway with facades, including the city hall, that define it. But perhaps the pioneering effort of the city, and this board are very commendable for it, is to recover the publicness of the waterfront, which had been privatized over the years by one developer after the other, by one tourist attraction after the other, and to connect it together, as many abandoned pieces like that, into a continuous boardwalk. And here our strategy was not so much to take it and create a continuous figure out of it, but to try to approximate through the geometry of every piece the features that the natural terrain gives us. So you can see a sequence of interventions that are different one from the other based on the topography, and it varies dramatically there, and the features do. But each of them is somehow tamed with a particular geometry that floats over the existing terrain in order for you to see the contrast. And that floating is strategic, both because we don't want to be heavy-handed and because we have no money, so we have to do it lightly. But the idea that the natural environment offers us certain clues of how to work, and that it's not determining how we do things, but it gives us certain possibilities, comes out of von Humboldt, and then later on by cultural geographers like Paul Vidal de la Blache, and the idea of possibilism, of the fact that architecture does not need to be determined by its setting or grounded in its setting, but the setting offers possibilities for architecture to exercise, to lay out, to play out of, and maximizing the benefit, but also moving you somewhere else, is something that I've been fascinated with. And this site, the boardwalk, offers us that. This is just a quick series of sections showing you the vast differences between one location and the other, and then how we try to tread lightly, but with very strong figurative gestures that define every location differently while maintaining a detachment, a kind of displacement of sorts in the site. This one is probably, we are trying to make that boardwalk float but also disappear, so that when people walk, they will look transparent like that. And then this is another one of those platforms that is at once there and floating. Which brings me back to the section of the City Hall. And it is exactly that. It's operating as being at once a carving into the ground so that it can stabilize the relationship between the highway and the inner city, while maintaining the continuity of the park and protecting it from noise and everything. This is a noise barrier up here that protects from that. But all of this device, this carving, grafting into the ground, is in order to lift up the building and allow it to float above those contingencies of site, noise, and place. And if there's any geography in the site, it is exactly that. The geography of the highway in its connectedness to the Roman axis that connects to the city and then the sea. Whereas the object itself is propped up by all of the particularities of that section. And here you see it in relationship to the much larger view of the city and the mess around it, and how, again, it's propped up. These are three little pigs that float above the mess that is around them. In a way, they operate as what Michel Serres calls quasi-objects. Let me describe a little bit more what that might mean. The project, as I described it, is very simple. We followed the program, a building for administration, a building for the governorship, and the third building for multi-purpose hall, which is now becoming an exhibition space for the alphabet. And we tried to maintain, but also activate the ground by carrying the park through the building with some bleachers, a cafe space, and then a public space at the back, with all the public services happening on the ground. That's where you pay your tickets, that's where you pay, you make all the transactions, and you can come in and leave without going up. There is a sense of these objects as being at once a figure and a seriality, at once being additive and subtractive. And this has been another preoccupation of mine. How do we make a figure repeat, but still maintain an attitude of a negative, of a subtractive form, rather than an additive form, or suspended in between? And this has been a series of experiments, particularly working with perspective, of how a repetition of a form through perspective can still be captured by a figuration that comes in from outside, in this case the coastline and a series of parasols floating, and by removing the ground and by removing the sticks that hold the parasols, this geometry is recovered, is made much more visible. But there's another aspect to the three blocks. Obviously there's the institutional. There is no municipality built in the modern era that does not present itself as institutional, and repetition in institutional form is something that we associate with Brasilia, we associate with EUR, we associate with many new cities, and how they demonstrate what the role of administration is vis-a-vis the public sector. The other aspect of it is, however, the notion of the quasi-object. And the notion of the quasi-object comes from Michel Serres. Michel Serres, the French philosopher, has described the fact that we are still thinking of subjects and objects as being a detriment to our ability to understand how the world is interconnected, how there is much more fluidity, and how the boundaries between things should not stop at that classical distinction. He proposes instead a quasi-object, and in that he uses the figure of the soccer ball as being the description of what a quasi-object is. He argues that the ball is a mute, dumb, stupid thing. But actually, it's not the ball that counts. It's how the ball orchestrates the spaces around it, particularly players. And he distinguishes a bad player from a good player by the amount of time the good player spends bringing the ball to himself, understanding the way the ball works, rather than the bad player who wants the ball to come to him, rather than the other way around. And in a sense, inverts the revolution, saying it should be Ptolemaic rather than Copernican. The ball itself has qualities, distinct intensive qualities of texture, shape, it dents, it breaks, etc. But its real activation is the way that it activates the players, the field. This dates me and shows my biases, but this is Luis Figo wearing the colors of Real Madrid, and taking the ball, activating it into the space of a stadium, a very large audience, and how the rules, regulations are all around this ball. And taken into the space of a pub in Byblos, watching the women's World Soccer Finals, or an indoors game in this city's high school or on the beach. In some ways, most of the projects in the office are like that. They are simple figures maintaining their objectness, but dented, distorted, punched, in order not so much to register what is happening inside them, but how they are interacting with their exterior. And it's always this register of how much push and how much pull happens in every object that we try to calibrate in order to show that architecture could at once be of the place and its own. This game of a quasi-object is recently on our mind in a project that we're designing. This is the first time I show it, and I've always been warned not to show a project too early, but hey, I want to show it to you because I want to hear your opinion about it. This is in a reserve in the mountains of Lebanon that covers about 5% of the country. It's kind of a way to rebuild the cedars forest, the historic, symbolic cedars forest of Lebanon. But there are also other trees like pines and all. And the attempt here is to not just reserve the nature, but the culture as well. And this was a donation from the USAID, landed from nowhere. It's not a quasi-object, it's more like a super object. Which is a place where you would store the ambulances and the snow plowing trucks for emergencies in the summer, in the winter. But for the rest of the year, it sits like an eyesore there. And the reserve asked me if I can help them turn it into a biodiversity platform where people can come and visit, and as one of the gateways to these recovered forests where they will be bringing back the Nubian ibex goats, which used to be in the area but left it, and now they're trying to bring them back, and bringing them back for different reasons. One is to recover the flora fauna, another is to activate culturally agriculture, but also as a way to help save the area from fires. The region suffers from fires late in the summer, September, October, particularly because the brush underneath burns. And in trying to recover the landscape, they're also trying to take not just the brush out, but also the remains of terrace walls that have encumbered somehow the flow of the fauna in the area. And the ibex as a figure comes back in, this is another quasi-object, to eat the thistle, to eat all of this stuff and help clear the ground of the forest. And they're trying to help also by weeding it out every year and removing the debris of the old terrace walls. The old terrace walls look like this. Some of them abandoned, but there are very beautiful moments where you actually see the sky through the rocks and their materiality somehow disappears. And the thistle, the shrubbery, looks like this. This is a very prevalent type, which is very beautiful in the spring, but becomes thorny shrubs. It's, I think, called in English, in Arabic it's called wizzel. In English it's called spiny broom. I think it's called the spiny broom. What we proposed was a very simple thing. Our budget is minimal. Is the trail that will take you into this forest where you will meet the ibex will start in the building. The trail will wrap around the building, take you to the roof, and then wrap back down and become the trail that takes you out in a three-dimensional way. We didn't touch the interior of the building, we just wrapped it. We put a big wrapper around it, a ramp, and that ramp becomes a hat, and on the top you will have a cafe, but you will also have some display ahead of the visit. And the ramp carves itself into the figure of the house. The interior is still to be worked out, but it's supposed to be dry, acidic, high-techy looking, and the exterior will look like this. The exterior is essentially the debris of the terrace walls regathered within a steel frame structure, but also transparent, and the upper part will be the thistle that will be dried and put together on a seasonal basis to pull things out from the site. And you will see the path there. So the building is really like the goat, clearing out the terrace walls and clearing out the shrubbery for the forest to recover. That's the top, that's the bottom. And that's the building seen from the point of view of the goats, and that's the building at night almost burning with the light from inside it glowing through it. So back to Byblos. I think the building right now as it stands is still suffering from a degree of isolation, but step after step it is beginning to become a quasi-object. The Roman axis has been extended by a pedestrian bridge. You saw it in some of the photographs. And recently we were asked to design another piece to it, again the repetitive but also the figural, and that piece is a staircase that will take you over the interchange passage in order to connect to the neighborhood across. And we designed it to be a fourth block, but a block that terminates the interchange angle as a triangular piece, so that it's almost like a clock tower in the conventional relationship to a town hall, but here, seen from different angles, it plays a very different role. That's seen from the cafe. It's under construction, and that's seen from the sky. Let me get into the program of the building. If we consider the way the building program was given to us, it's actually quite simple. We were asked to delineate spaces for 3 different functions. One is the offices of police, engineering, staff. The middle one was the administration of the mayor and others. And the third one was a salle polyvalente. It's a term used constantly in the region, but it actually means a space open for anything. Right now, an exhibition is being mounted for the history of the alphabet. Initially, the mayor wanted his office here and wanted me to open a window here. And when I said to him, you can't open a window in a block, he was very upset. Miraculously, it turned out that this block, when you stand here through this window, you can actually see the bay of the city and the old Crusader castle. So we convinced him to move there without having to open a window there. That window is still a stigma, but I'll come back to it later on. The plans are 3 envelopes. We pushed everything on the edges, structure, and service, and left the field open. These are reminding me of the pains we have faced in order to make it a truss, but they wouldn't let us, so we made them into round columns. And since then, every time I see a round pilotis, I think of it as being a structure that could have been bigger, but this is a kind of placeholder for ideas that have been value engineered. And this is the ground plane where you see the continuity of the park carrying through and out. This notion of intensity of edges and openness came about in a difficult way because we started the office in '98. In about 2000, we worked with the René Mawad Foundation in the north to build a center which is for agriculture, but included administration. It included a school for hospitality, a technical school, a dairy farm is the administration part, and a daycare center on the upper level. It was impossible to program it well and to put everything together. So we resorted, after trial and error, to create a series of very large open spaces that could be separating but also shared by the different functions in order to save on space. This created a building that is made out of 1,000 courtyards in a way. Even though the building is still not finished, what remains very clearly, very strongly in them is the role that these courtyards play in the livelihood of the building, with the rest as a placeholder. And the way that the building's horizontality is registered in relationship to the section and to Mount Lebanon and to the sky. This also came about when we started working on the balloon. And if you think of this logic of the intense edge and open space as being something like when you start drawing a square in your sketchbook, you never get it right? You draw again, and it's the approximation of all those different lines that create the figure of a square, but you can never really geometrically say, this is it. And it also creates a density around that can provide the support for a space that is open and free and could be occupied by different activities informed by the edges. The balloon was exactly that, and the clearance there was dictated by the operations of the balloon and by the slope. So we tucked everything in the ground in a very thin edge. It was a temporary structure, and therefore we had to house everything in that very thin space all around. The houses of Amshit are the same, a series of 4 houses plugged into the landscape, each with different ways of holding back, but all of them designed with a very big free span of about 15 meters with post-tension beams in order to create the space around them free. They are, in a way, a retaining wall that is extended to become the tower. These are free spans, and the towers themselves are also an L shape that keeps the kind of provide thermal mass against the southern and eastern sun, and then opens up the view to the western and northern sea views. And the thickness of the wall is at once a thickness that is structural, mechanical, and service. So everything happens in that thickness that holds back the earth and creates that freedom for the space to happen in. You can see here you can see the service passage from which we draw air in order to cool the space. The temperature here is about 2 degrees less than outside. And we worked with Transolar to pull water from the sea, which is cooler, to chill the chillers, and then to pass the cold water in the thicknesses of the walls in a system called gravity walls. So it's not an air movement system, but a refrigeration system, a passive one, that cools the spaces. Again, in the thickness behind the closets and behind the bookshelves. There's a series of plans showing one of the iterations of the 4 houses. Each one is slightly different. But that thickness is also taken in section. You can see it, the ground itself is lifted up also for ventilation. When you walk on the ground outside, it's actually quite cool. And the staircase, the stair tower acts as a chimney with outlets for the hot air connected to it. And that's the section of the courtyard, which itself plays a game in the circulation of the air, but provides reprieve from that openness and horizontality outside. Thus the name court towers, courtyard and tower. And that's the view from the upper level. You're walking here through the thickness of the walls. That's the staircase, the passage. And there's always an attempt at carving to reveal that thickness again and again, whether in the railing, in the lighting, or in the way that the windows are placed in the towers. Just to give you an example, this is the entrance from the upper level into the turret. And this little window sticking out here is the sink in the bathroom. The bathrooms are very compact. It wasn't very comfortable to put the sinks in, so we pushed them out. And in pushing them out, you started getting light and view, this air this way, so that people can't look in, and the mirror in front of you that would reflect the view behind you, the garden behind you. And that's the way it operates. This is the courtyard looking at the living room, and here you see hidden in the thickness of the bookshelves is the cooling system. Every house has its lemon tree. And then even the seating in the spaces are carved. The kitchen sink is carved, each with a different color stone. And the seating in the garden is also carved. So again, the niche as a motif in the revealing the thicknesses. And the tower itself operates in the same way. The wooden louvers open up, and then the glass walls open up, and they open up again, so that every bedroom becomes a balcony. Again, turning the whole space into just a thick wall and the platform from which you see the world. Same happens at the pool level. You see the different shutters operating to open up to get you into the service areas or the bar area. This is the bar area. It was a very big fight about whether the grain of the blue stone should be vertical or horizontal. I insisted on vertical, because I didn't want to imitate the sea. You cannot imitate the sea. And these are other views of the complex, the main house, which also operates as a kind of open frame, looking back in. We did the same with this mosque, and the mosque is an easy space to do that with, kind of thick exterior and then a whole open space that emulates a kind of scooping of ice cream into a form. That's the exterior of it with cuts. And in that moment, there was a whole crisis of the mosque in Switzerland where they decided to forbid minarets. And so the joke here was that we would carve a minaret out of the volume of the mosque without going higher, but it's still a minaret because of the way it is cut. And that's the interior. I would say that this gesture of the intense edge can be taken to another scale. And we tried it here in the school project in the outskirts of Damascus, which was stopped because of the war, where we tried to apply that scalar nestedness of the courtyard logic in a very harsh environment, so that to protect the students at every scale, but also to create a kind of haven for the landscape to grow in. And this is short animation that illustrates this happening at different scales, and then adjusting as it turns around to fit the sloping site. I would say Byblos operates like that, but perhaps more than in plan, there's that spatial void that it creates in section, which allows for the freedom of activity to happen underneath. And this idea of how much architecture prescribes the activities that happen in it versus how much space or how much air it leaves so that it displaces, it becomes background to what life can bring unexpectedly or expectedly, has been something that I've been thinking about for a while. And when I met a couple of years ago in Sao Paulo, Paulo Mendes da Rocha, and I was describing that quality to him, he said the following. He said, architecture is the art of delineating the space for life's unpredictability. I would like to think of that as being the unpredictability as being a cyanometric scale as well. Lastly, I come to the notion of the surface. And here, I would like to spend it in discussing two attributes of the surface: its intrinsic qualities, but also its connection to communication, its external qualities. When we won the competition, it was in black and white. And we had proposed, in a kind of very quick Photoshop way, 3 blocks with huge pieces of sandstone on them, because we knew that sandstone was the official stone of the city. But when we won, we had to build this, and you can't find pieces of sandstone that big. So we were stuck. You have to build this, we were told, and we said, we can't do that. So we said, figure it out. So we thought of the process of giving it certain materiality through color. And there's a sense of coloring that can be very arbitrary, as in the coloring books where you have a thing like a palette where you can color it with any combination of colors and it is believable. The color somehow comes in from outside and it doesn't matter. We had tried this problem, or this approach, in the work we did for the fishermen of Tyre. I grew up thinking of architecture as only white. And Judith Wallen will forgive me for using color. She taught me about white, but she also taught me about color. But other teachers would not. There's a sense that color is external to architecture, is polluting of architecture. And in this case, the housing of the fishermen was meant to be white, granulated white with stamping on it and all, but we ran out of money. And one day I get a call from the contractor and said, there's only money for a coat of paint. I panicked, I sweated, went back and said, what color? He said, all colors cost the same, any color. So through a bit of therapy, I got over my chromophobia. And the reason I had to use color is because the finishes were not very good. They were meant for a thicker coat. And yet, when you paint them white like that, they become you're revealing and exaggerating the mistakes. So we started playing around with color, and we used it as a way to distract from the rigidity of the volumes, to turn corners, to contrast with the light rather than play with it, play against it, especially when the sun is hitting. And we used cold colors on the outside and warm colors on the inside. We also went back to Goethe, to Joseph Albers, but we dwelt quite a bit on Le Corbusier, and discovered in the Polychromie Architecturale a series of rules about colors, particularly the color blue. And in one of the passages from that book, he talks about blue as being a prevalent color. He talks that for him, and over 20 years, color occupied half his day as a painter, where blue prevailed, blue and green in echo. And he goes on to describe the color blue. And indeed, as Nader mentioned, I've worked a lot on his travelogues, and in his travelogues, blue recurs as a motif, as a theme, as a mood. And let's face it, blue is the color of modernity, and it persists as the color of the modern era. But I feel like it's time to recover it as a spatial quality, not just as a color. This is a blue sheet from the whole book of the poem of the right angle. It's not the screen being blank. But think about it. Whenever you open your screen, by default, it's almost this blue. And what he liked about the blue is that it offered the possibility of displacement, meaning every time you paint a surface blue, it recedes, and it allows other things to move forward. But yet, if you isolate it as an architectural feature against natural elements, it's highly artificial. There's hardly many things that are blue in nature, and therefore it becomes this kind of tension of it being at once a natural background, but also a very artificial object floating forward. We used it in entire, again, for lack of a better word, in a symphonic way, so that it's not corresponding to the volumes or the quarters, but slipping, creating half groupings, so that it doesn't express the individual unit or window, or doesn't express the overall volume, but somewhere in between. But it also plays the leakage role from inside to outside, and tries to break down the volumes or exaggerate them dependingly, showing some transparency, some overlaps of volumes, and that's the image we started with. Blue comes up also in the pavilion we did for the Shenzhen Biennale in 2011. Jonathan is here. He helped me on this one quite a bit, building it and getting it done in an impossible time. But here the idea was to recreate, according to the curator, the Strada Novissima. How does an architectural object reside in a street? The Strada Novissima was the moment of postmodernism where the facade prevailed, and here we wanted the object to come back. But we made it float, and we painted it blue, so that while it aligns with the rest of the walls, it maintains its independence, and you can get into it by slipping from underneath the geometry, but it remains conforming to the height, and by lifting the horizon line a bit, it sort of displaces itself and you at the same time. Another approach to coloration comes from the way in which we color historic photographs. It's not external only. There's some clues that you get from the picture itself, but it is not that clear that Lincoln looked sepia and we don't, or that his clothes looked washed and ours don't, or that the background itself was brown and not. It's kind of approximation, but also a very clear intervention in order to make the picture look like it is 19th century. We played that game in this project, which is a library, branch library in Beirut, never built, but there's in it a game of elevating the texture of the concrete to make it sand-like, so that to make the exaggeration of the color of the sand and the aggregate, but also an inscription on the surface of the windows which follows the ramps. And so you have this kind of juxtaposition of something coming out of the surface and something being inscribed in it, almost like a Mark Rothko meeting Frank Stella, where that reverberation against the surface is captured in that coloration. And we used it in the balloon project, where we literally took the sand and pigmented the cement with it, and exaggerated the pigment with paint, and then we took the cement and painted the wood with it. This is the formwork itself being used to create partitions inside, because we didn't have money. But when it came to building Byblos, I experimented with these different colorations and presented the city with different possibilities. They said, no, you have to use sandstone. And they were already in the process of embellishing the facades of the old Roman axis with sandstone, trying to use it in antiquated manners, removing the plaster from inside the churches to reveal the sandstone, which is not supposed to be done because it's obviously not built to be revealed, and the bazaar itself being covered with sandstone. Some houses were required to do that and did it in a good way, but sandstone is a very brittle stone, and it ages and collects pollution and is really inconsistent color-wise. So how can we possibly use that and still maintain control over it at that scale and not reveal through its scale breakdown of the scale of these big monoliths along the highway? This was the headquarters of the municipality before they moved. This is their meeting place in the old city. Again, sandstone revealed under the plaster. And here are some of the ruins of old buildings which they were trying to cut and sell to us. But they kept saying that it's the stone of the old city, but it's not true. The sandstone is the infill behind the limestone or granite that would be applied on the outside to protect it. It's only revealed like that when you steal the other stone, and it's revealed like that. I kept saying no until one morning 4 trucks of sandstone were dropped on the site. And I was told, deal with it. And here they are in all of their inconsistencies presented to you in this display. I was at that time buying stone for another project in Verona, and I met this very piece of stone. It was a very beautiful big travertino stone, big sheet, 8 feet by 4 feet or something like that. And I thought, I wish that sandstone could be like that. went back to the site and discovered, as we were trying to figure out what to do, that when you look at the sandstone sideways in its thinness, the color becomes more constant because you're almost cutting through a grain that is revealing its coloration, and because the area is smaller, you get a more consistent color. We said, what if the building can actually be the travertine sheet? We pixelated it and said, okay, we can define the sandstone in 4 colors if we look at them sideways. We tried different grains and colors, introduced some blue, but it turned out that some of the sandstone has the blue, and came up with a pixelated panel that we carried across the whole thing so that all 3 buildings would look like they were carved out of the same block. We worked with a Syrian refugee from Aleppo, who's a very masterful stonemason. We determined the size by which we can cut them without plaster between, so we can just glue them on the wall. And we started separating them into 4 piles. Every time we cut, we'd separate them into 4 piles, and then created 4 big piles. And with his help, we determined that all he needed was a grid drawing of the image transferred into a grid sheet, and that as he was starting to put them up, he would be on the ground with a guy on the top, coloring every area as they moved up. And with only one mistake, they managed to do the whole block, meaning one time that they had to remove the pieces and put them back, they managed to do the whole building with no problem. We expressed the thinness of it on the bottom so that when you, from a distance, you think of it as one big block, and then as you get closer, it starts revealing its artifact to you. This is the master mason who helped us with this whole process. So we went from this to this to this to this to this. Now you see it from the highway at a speed, it looks like 3 big blocks. And here you see the blocks from the other side. The last aspect of the building has to do with its ability to communicate, to exchange ideas, to exchange languages. And here again, I think there's another dimension of our craft that is a bit inhibiting of exploration of that sort, which has to do with the monomania that architects have in mind, that the field itself has to control every aspect of the form, rather than allow for other arts or forms of communication to dwell within it. For the longest time, architecture was not the dominant art, it was the host for the other arts to exist within it. You'd create a decoration program for textiles to happen, for sculpture to happen, for inscription to happen, rather than have to do all of that yourself or turn all of that into architecture. When we won the competition, we had proposed a trellis form. But then that trellis form, which went under the building on the side, became challenged by cost, by materiality. It was supposed to be wood. And by the fact that the city wanted a certain expressive dimension to happen, particularly that they decided on the alphabet as being a theme. And if you know your alphabet, you know that the first phonetic alphabet was invented in Byblos. The alphabet was invented in Byblos, thus the connection with Byblos, which is the Greek word for book, because they invented the first phonetic alphabet, which till now is the basis of all other phonetic alphabets. This idea of writing on the surface had started in the explorations for Tyre, for the housing for the fishermen, where we were thinking of stenciling the thickness of that aggregate in order to distinguish the different facades from each other. But in the end, it ended up just being screens, like calligraphy on the sides, and perhaps a other form of writing was the side elevations, which read deliberately like a form of hieroglyphic registering on the sides. In the balloon, we used the chevron pattern to create signage, arrows. We brought asphalt to the interior because, again, we didn't have money, and we wrote on it as if it was a tarmac in an airport, but here it was a balloon port, indicating arrivals, departures, where kids sit, or if you inscribed in it an arrow, it becomes an exit or an entrance. Again, we did that kind of idea of signage in the writing of the windows in this building. We moved from wood to aluminum, particularly because of cost, but also maintenance. And we thought that if we wanted to contrast the alphabet with the most recent form of writing, the kind of ubiquitous barcode, both ubiquitous in products and in architecture, could be used there. And we took the words of Byblos, Jbeil, and played with them. And here again, we wanted to decide on how the vertical surface becomes a canopy that covers inside and then goes up in order to create those enclosed spaces, but again, separated from the volume so that they reveal very strongly the thinness and the artifice of application. The color was decided upon also in an arbitrary way. I saw in a magazine at home the most recent collection of Dries van Noten's clothes, and I've always noticed how amazing his colors were. And when Dries decides on a color combination, you know it's a good one. So in this case, there was a Prussian blue with a kind of sandy color that was in the collection, and I thought, okay, we will borrow that. And we borrowed that in Byblos, and it actually proved to be very good because the black and blue in Dries was also important to help us create this planarity. But also the blue on a good day, the Prussian blue, which we borrowed from him, helped reflect the sky very beautifully. And it almost disappeared in certain instances. And here it is in play with the bridges, with the passages, and how it becomes an inscription of lighting on the inside with the irregular surfaces, and then a play with the surface here. The inner wall of the mural, of the noise barrier, was something that we wanted to give to the arts, but we didn't have time. So we decided that we would propose a mural, which would be a temporary one, made out of the Phoenician alphabet that would take it from alphabet to geometry, which is the basis of it, in order to simplify it, and would spread it along the wall almost like something you'd see at speed, reflecting the highway behind, and translating parts of it into patterns that resembled Morse code, another form of writing, and registering against the barcode as another language to be contrasted together. To think of the architecture not as a dominant surface that expresses everything, but a surface that hosts the different languages of the world. So a kind of multiplicity rather than singularity. Despite all the coloring, I still believe that there's a certain beauty to the building in black and white. These we received from a local photographer where he shows the different languages at play. The alphabet behind, the Arabic calligraphy, which says the municipality of Byblos, and then the barcode against, and here contrasted against the stone. This idea of architecture becoming a surface is enforced by Jacques Rancière in his essay, The Surface of Design, where he talks about the idea that the graphic and the visual can coexist on the surface, and that the different languages of the world work together. So instead of us thinking of a universal language as being abstraction, we can think of the universal language as being the superimposition of different forms of communication, whether it's the material, whether it's the graphic, whether it's the linguistic, coexisting and sharing with each other, overlapping and connecting. So that locality becomes expressed by the multiplicities that form it, rather by singularities that isolate it. Just before we finished the project, Byblos went on another Christmas decoration spree. They came up with this amazing tree at the end of the Roman axis and decorated the axis itself. But true to our desire to make the building a surface of exchange and communication, they projected Christmas animations on the surface. What upsets me the most is that they skipped this part, therefore making each surface separate rather than continuous, and that skip here is also upsetting. Fortunately, they were convinced that they can leave the building alone. And the new mayor at that point wanted to put the window back in this facade because he thought the offices were only getting northern light. But fortunately, with the coloring of white on the inside, the glare was strong enough that they were convinced they needed no glare, and when they opened the windows and heard the noise from the highway, they understood that turning away from the southern facade and from the highway noise was a good thing. But there's a certain vulnerability to architecture which again brings me back to its blueness. The idea that it could be mistaken for background, that it could be absorbed into the chaos, into the noise of its moment, makes us as architects always have kind of heartache. We're going with every project to the end, but then when we hand it over, we don't know what will happen. Fortunately, at the opening, they left it alone. They did not project anything on it, and they projected sideways. I could not attend, and they asked me to send a word to say something. At that time, there was a whole, again, debate about changing the interior radically, and I was trying to convince them, let the building live with you for a year or two until you decide whether you change it or not. And I remembered at that time that the Arabs in Andalusia, when they finished the building, they would write a poem as if the building was speaking, the building describing its qualities, its seductive qualities, and asking the users to pay attention to them and to protect them. So in my despair, that's me there, desperate, I wrote a poem in Arabic called I Am the House, based on a poem written for the Alhambra called I Am the Garden, describing the qualities of the house, saying, here is the park that runs underneath, don't block me, I am 3 rocks, please don't touch me, I am the alphabet, please don't change me, etc., etc. Fortunately, last year the building won an award from the Lebanese Architecture League, and that has protected it a little bit, and it got published quite a bit, so they're proud of that. And it recently featured on a on a Lebanese stamp, so I'm hoping that that will protect it enough. And in our work with them since to carry the project forward to the larger scale, to the master plan, where we're working with the Rockefeller Foundation, working with the UNESCO to create the boardwalk, the other parts. There's a certain partnership, but still vulnerable because politicians change and ideas change, that the building will somehow survive. Here we took it all under the theme of the color blue to the Chile Biennale in Valparaiso, and showed it against the different measures of the blue sky of Byblos, where the different public places that we imagined, in addition to the square, in addition to the building, will be displayed. But in the end, I sometimes feel that the kind of blue that architecture needs is that of the blue against the evil eye, protecting us from the vulnerabilities of time, maybe from the evil eye. I have outlived your generosity, I think, of time. I know that you have a lot of work to do. Thank you very much for your patience and attendance. I have put in front of you many new ideas, things that I'm thinking about now, new projects, and ideas that are still in formation. So I would greatly appreciate, through your questions and feedback, help to articulate them even more. Thank you, Cooper.